For the best experience, I highly recommend putting on headphones. The basement of the museum was always dead silent. The muffled hum of traffic from the avenue above never made it down here. There was absolutely no cell service. My only companion during my 12-hour night shifts was a professional flatbed document scanner. Its quiet, monotonous whirring and the steady green light creeping beneath the thick glass replaced any need for human contact. I had been working in the archives for 6 years. My job was straightforward. Take old negatives, glass photographic plates, and Soviet-era film. Gently clean off decades of dust with a soft camel hair brush. Place them into a special frame and hit scan. On my monitor, cutting through the basement's gloom, the faces of people who had long passed away would slowly manifest. I'd look at their smiles, their old-fashioned hairstyles, and their pioneer ties, feeling like a medium summoning ghosts from the void. Each scanned frame was a tiny window into a vanished world, and I was the sole audience for this endless, silent performance. That particular night was freezing. The museum's heating hadn't been turned on yet, and the old cast-iron pipes only occasionally groaned and rattled beneath the ceiling, as if complaining about the dampness. I sat in my cramped workstation, wrapped in an old woolen sweater, sipping lukewarm tea from a thermos. The smell of vinegar in the room was unbearable. Any archivist knows what vinegar syndrome is. It's an incurable disease that affects old acetate film. When storage conditions are compromised, the cellulose begins to decay, releasing free acetic acid. The film shrivels, becomes brittle, covers itself in tiny bubbles, and reeks of standard table vinegar. Once it starts, it's unstoppable. The film literally eats itself, turning into a toxic mush. The only way to save the history captured on it is to digitize it before the emulsion completely separates from the backing. That was exactly what I found in a box on the furthest shelf of the unsorted arrivals section, the stuff pulled from closed-down regional museums. It was a round film tin, completely coated in flaking reddish-brown rust. There was no inventory number, no accompanying note, just a half-faded inscription in blue pencil on the rusty lid. Krasny Yar, October 1968. Destruction Fund. Krasny Yar, I repeated to myself, recalling the local history. It was a small village nestled in a valley by the river, completely submerged in the fall of 1968 during the construction of a local hydroelectric dam. The residents were hastily resettled. The wooden cabins were burned or torn apart for firewood, and the cemetery and old brick church were simply flooded over. Now, the gray waves of the reservoir surged over Krasny Yar, and only during the driest years would the tip of the half-ruined bell tower peak above the water. I pried the tin open. A sharp, acidic stench of vinegar hit my nose, making me cough and squeeze my eyes shut. At the bottom of the tin, wrapped in a yellowed copy of the Pravda newspaper from August 1968, lay glass photographic plates, about 9 by 12 centimeters. Glass negatives are durable, but the dampness had caused the emulsion along the edges to peel, curling into black, dry spirals. Carefully holding the first plate by its edges, I lifted it up to the dim desk lamp. On the black glass, the inverted silhouettes of a crowd appeared. It looked like some sort of procession. The faces looked like stark white masks with hollow black eye sockets, the usual effect of a negative frame. I set the plate onto the scanner glass, shut the heavy lid, and clicked the digital capture button. The scanner whirred to life. A bright, even beam of green light crept under the lid. I turned to my monitor. On the black screen, line by line, from top to bottom, the image began to resolve. It was a funeral at a village cemetery, surrounded by thin, barren birch trees. Judging by the lack of leaves and the light frost dusting the grass, it was late autumn, the exact time Krasny Yar was living out its final days before submersion. In the center of the frame stood wooden sawhorses supporting a simple pine coffin. Gathered around it were about 30 people, women in dark shawls pulled low over their eyes, men in heavy wool coats and caps holding their hats in their hands. They stood perfectly still, frozen in a mournful trance before the lens of an unknown photographer. The detail was staggering. Old Soviet lenses yielded incredible sharpness under good light. I could see every wrinkle on the face of an elderly woman by the coffin, see the tears frozen on her cheeks. But my attention was drawn away from the coffin and the weeping crowd. On the very edge of the frame, right at the boundary of the lens's focus, a man stood beneath a sprawling birch tree. He stood out starkly against the rest of the villagers. He wore a long, heavy, double-breasted black coat. Its collar popped so high that it completely concealed his neck and the lower half of his face. A deep, wide-brimmed black hat was pulled low over his head. The man stood slightly sideways to the camera, as if trying to hide behind the tree trunk, but his silhouette caught the frame anyway. The strangest thing was that his figure was blurred. Motion blur isn't rare on old photos. If the shutter speed was slow, any movement caused a person's contours to smear into a ghostly streak. But everyone else in this photograph was perfectly sharp. You could see the texture of the wool on their coats. They hadn't moved an inch. Yet this man in the black coat was blurred, as if he were in rapid, violent motion, streaking directly toward the coffin. He probably just stepped forward right when the shutter clicked, I thought, pushing down a minor wave of unease. A simple technical flaw from 50 years ago. I removed the first plate, carefully set it aside, and pulled out the second. It was from the same series. The photographer had clearly taken shots one after another, seconds apart. I lined it up, started the scan, and watched the monitor. The same cemetery, the same people. The coffin still sat on the sawhorses, but they were beginning to close the lid. Two men in quilted jackets held it up. The crowd had shifted slightly, pressing closer to the grave. I immediately darted my eyes to the birch tree at the edge of the frame. The man in the black coat was gone. I felt a brief pang of disappointment, thinking he had just walked out of the shot and ruined the mystery. But then my eyes scanned the mourning crowd. He was there. The man in the black coat was now standing right in the middle of the crowd, shoving his way between two weeping women. His figure was still blurred by the long exposure, but now the distortion looked different. His contours stretched forward toward the coffin, as if he were moving through the crowd with an unnatural, terrifying speed, forcing his way through their shoulders. The most disturbing part? No one around him reacted to his presence. The woman he was passing right next to kept her eyes fixed on the coffin. Her face showed no surprise, no fear, even though this man in the black coat should have been physically crushing her aside. And then his face. Because of the motion blur, his face was a white, smudged smear, but it felt like two dark, completely round eyes were staring back at me through the haze. The museum basement suddenly went dead quiet. The scanner's hum ceased. The second frame was done. I sat before the computer monitor, feeling a faint, ice-cold draft prickle the hairs on the back of my neck. The smell of vinegar in the room grew so intense that it made my throat raw. I looked at the rusty tin on the desk. There were 4 glass plates left inside. My fingers, clad in the thin cotton gloves I always wore to handle negatives, shook noticeably as I reached into the box. The glass felt incredibly cold, almost frozen, as if it had just been pulled from a deep snowdrift rather than a dry archive drawer. I dusted it with the brush, set it on the glass, closed the lid, and started the process. The green light crawled. I stared at the screen, a heavy dread pooling in my stomach. Line by line, the 3rd frame appeared. The procession had reached the grave itself. The coffin had already been lowered on ropes into the dark earth. People stood at the edge of the pit, some holding clods of dirt to throw onto the lid. The frame captured that absolute, final silence found only in rural graveyards in late autumn. But the man in the black coat was no longer hiding in the crowd. He stood at the very brink of the open grave, directly opposite a weeping woman in a dark shawl. On this frame, his blurriness was almost entirely gone. It was as if with every new plate I digitized, his figure gained density, materializing from the silver fog of the old emulsion into physical reality. Now I could make out his coat. It was made of a heavy, coarse cloth, caked with frozen mud along the hem. His arms hung down at his sides, but his fingers, they looked too long, thin, entirely devoid of natural knuckles, as if flexible wooden twigs were hidden beneath the black fabric instead of bone. The collar of the coat remained popped, but his hat had shifted back. He had no face. Where his nose and mouth should have been, there was only smooth, tightly stretched skin, completely blank of pores or wrinkles. It looked like a wax mask that had been left in the heat too long, causing all its features to run and smooth out into a blank oval. And right in the center of that waxy surface were two dark, perfectly round holes, completely missing eyelids or eyelashes. He was staring directly at whoever held the camera 50 years ago. My breath caught in my throat. Blood pounded in my temples. The smell of vinegar in the room abruptly vanished, replaced by something else. It smelled of wet earth and formaldehyde. It was so overwhelming, it felt like I was standing right at the edge of that grave in Krasny Yar under a freezing October rain. An old memory surfaced, an old family album kept by my grandmother in her remote village. It was a heavy album, bound in burgundy velvet with a brass clasp. When I was a kid, I was strictly forbidden from opening it without permission. But one day, when the adults were out, I opened it anyway. Among the usual yellowed wedding and family photos from the early 20th century lay a few pictures that made my blood run cold. They were post-mortem photographs, memento mori shots that were highly popular in pre-revolutionary Russia. In one, a little girl lay in a carved wooden coffin. My grand aunt, who died of typhus at age 5. She looked like she was just asleep, her hair neatly brushed, a paper flower tucked into her hand. But her eyes were propped slightly open, and someone had crudely, clumsily painted pupils directly onto her dried sclera. My grandmother caught me looking at it, but she didn't yell. She just quietly took the album away, latched the brass clasp, and said words I've remembered my entire life. Don't look too long at the dead on paper, Andriusha. An old photograph isn't just a picture. If you stare into it long enough, something from the afterlife will notice you, and it will want to climb back through the very glass it left through. I looked over at the scanner. My fingers were going numb from the cold. The temperature in the basement had dropped so low that the metal trim of the desk was coated in a fine layer of frost. A frost pattern was slowly blooming across the scanner glass around the cooling photographic plate. I pulled out the fourth plate. It felt heavier than the others, as if the glass itself had thickened. The emulsion had blistered into large bubbles, resembling burns on human skin. I cleaned it, fighting the resistance of my own body, which was screaming at me, "Drop it! Get out! Lock the door and run upstairs to the light, to the people." but curiosity, mixed with a paralyzing terror, was stronger. I laid the plate down. The scanner whirred, and the fourth frame manifested. The cemetery was empty. The people had left. In the background, you could only see their retreating backs dissolving into the fog between the birches. The grave was filled. A fresh mound of dirt rose in its place, topped by a simple wooden cross. But in the foreground of the shot, barely 3 feet from the lens, stood the man in the black coat. His figure wasn't blurred at all anymore. I could see every single fiber on his coarse cloth coat, the rusted dirt on his buttons, the cracks on his waxy face. His long, jointless fingers were reaching straight out toward the camera lens, as if he were trying to grab the photographer by the clothes. His black, hollow sockets filled nearly the entire center of the frame. I recoiled from the desk. My chair flipped over with a loud crash, slamming into the metal shelving. Boxes of archival folders cascaded to the floor, kicking up clouds of ancient dust. And in that moment, in the absolute ringing silence of the basement, a sharp, distinct click echoed. It came from the dark, long corridor of the archive, right outside the flimsy wooden door of my workstation. It was the exact sound of the shutter on an old mechanical Zenit camera when the finger presses the release button. And right after the click came the footsteps. Slow, heavy thuds of someone walking on the concrete floor with bare feet, dragging the heavy, wet hem of a long coat behind them. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I sat on the floor among the scattered cardboard boxes and old folders, pressing my back against the cold metal of the shelves. My knees were pulled tight to my chest, my teeth chattering uncontrollably. My ears rang so violently, it felt like a tiny, high-frequency interference generator was buzzing inside my head. The air in the room had fully turned to icy fog. The smell of vinegar was gone, replaced by the thick stench of rotting rags. I stared at the keyhole. The old wooden door was flimsy, painted over in several layers of dull oil paint, leaving wide gaps between the door and the frame. Out of those gaps, a thick, white, freezing vapor began to roll into the room. It spilled down the door, pooling onto the floor in dense, churning clouds. Following the vapor, water began to seep under the door. Dirty, murky river water mixed with tiny strands of riverweed and black silt. It slowly pooled across the linoleum, surrounding the scattered archive folders. The water was ice cold. Where it touched the metal legs of the desk, white ice crystals instantly bloomed. From the other side of the door came a wet rustle, like heavy, soaked wool rubbing against painted wood. "Andre," a whisper hissed. The sound didn't come from the hallway. It came directly from the speakers of my monitor, which had suddenly flared to life, glowing with a dim, steady green light. The scanner motor gave a long, pathetic groan, fighting against the resistance of its frozen gears. "Develop the plate," the voice rustled. I looked at the desk. There, next to the scanner, on the frost-covered tabletop, sat the rusty tin film box. Inside it were 2 glass plates left, the final frames of that terrifying funeral procession from October 1968. The door to my workstation began to slowly creak inward, its hinges groaning under an immense weight. An icy fog poured into the widening gap, thick with the stench of river rot. He stood on the threshold, the man in the long black coat. Up close, he seemed even more massive, his shoulders nearly brushing against the frame of the narrow doorway. The hem of his coat was dripping wet, heavy, muddy water splattering onto the floor in thick droplets. The black, wide-brimmed hat was pulled down to his brows, or rather, where a human's brows should be. His smooth, waxy face looked semi-translucent in the dim green light of the monitor, like cheap paraffin wax. The 2 black, round holes where his eyes should be were fixed right on me. Through them, I could see a slow, undulating movement of pale threads inside his head. The entity took a step forward, his bare, gray foot stepping into the puddle of filthy water on the floor. I couldn't move. It wasn't just fear. It was a physical paralysis. The kind where your muscles turn to stone and the blood freezes in your veins. "I don't want to die," I whispered in my mind, closing my eyes. "Not like this. Not here in this damp darkness." But in the depths of my soul, another voice echoed. The calm, quiet, soothing voice of my late grandmother. "The one who leaves their shadow on the silver. And if you look into it long enough, that shadow will notice you and want to come back." I opened my eyes. The man in the black coat was standing right at the desk. His long, jointless fingers slowly reached into the rusty tin. He pulled out the 5th glass plate. On this one, the emulsion had almost entirely peeled away, leaving only a murky gray residue around the edges of the glass. The entity, carefully, with an unsettling tenderness, laid the plate onto the scanner glass and pressed it down with the heavy lid. The scanner hummed. The even green light pierced the icy fog of my workstation. I forced my eyes toward the computer monitor. The scan revealed the photographer himself, or rather, his reflection in the foggy, ice-rimmed mirror of an old wardrobe that someone had discarded near the cemetery fence. The mirror reflected a man holding a fed camera. His face was pale, terrified, and standing right behind him with long, cold hands resting on his shoulders was the man in the black coat. But on my monitor, the image began to alter right before my eyes. I stared at the screen and saw my own face in the murky glass glass of that wardrobe, my woolen sweater, my terrified eyes, my disheveled hair, and standing right behind me was the massive figure in the soaked black coat. A sharp, deafening camera shutter click blasted through the room, and a blindingly bright white flash ripped the workstation out of the dark for a fraction of a second. Then, everything plunged into absolute dead silence. On Monday morning, Semyon Petrovich, an elderly archivist, made his way down into the museum basement. He walked slowly, holding on to the metal railings. His lower back had been aching since he woke up, and his knees weren't what they used to be. In his left hand, he carried his trusty thermos of strong tea. The door to the digitization room was slightly ajar. Semyon Petrovich nudged it open with his shoulder and froze on the threshold. The air inside was freezing. A sharp stench of vinegar mixed with heavy river muck hit his nose. The old man instinctively took a step back, covering his mouth with his hand. Andrei wasn't in the room. His chair was flipped over. Cardboard boxes containing archival files were scattered across the entire floor. Yellowed papers fanning out between the shelves. Many of them had soaked through and turned to mush because the linoleum was completely flooded with water. Several filthy, murky puddles where small strands of riverweed floated. "What in the world?" Semyon Petrovich muttered. On the desk, amidst the chaos, sat the rusty tin film box. Its lid was thrown back. Semyon Petrovich stepped closer and peered inside. Resting alone at the bottom of the tin was the very last glass photographic plate. Krasny Yar, October 1968. Destruction Fund. The archivist read aloud, tracing the faded blue pencil text on the lid. What happened here? And where did Andrei go? Left his work unfinished and just walked out? That doesn't sound like him. Mulling it over, Semyon Petrovich lifted the plate from the tin, holding it with his bare fingers by the very edges. The glass burned with a biting cold, as if it had just been pulled from a commercial freezer. The old man gasped softly in surprise, set it down, and clicked the scanner's start button. The scanner hummed to life. Out of habit, Semyon Petrovich adjusted his glasses and leaned in close to the monitor as the image loaded. The old black and white photograph from 1968 depicted the empty, abandoned cemetery of the submerged village. Standing among the thin, barren birch trees, right beside a fresh burial mound, were two figures. Both wore long, heavy black coats and wide-brimmed hats. They stood shoulder to shoulder, absolutely motionless, staring straight into the camera lens with their round, hollow black eye sockets. And the face of one of those figures, despite the heavy grain of the ancient emulsion, bore an undeniable, terrifying resemblance to Andrei. If you enjoyed this story, please support the channel with a like and a subscription. Until next time.